I remember temperature. 37 degrees, the standard human baseline, maintained by flesh alone without chemical assistance or augmentation. I remember that my body used to regulate itself. This was before the ecclesiarchy took measurement of my soul and found it insufficient. My name was Marcus Thelen. I served as a data clerk in the administrative archive of Hive Tertius on Scintilla. For 11 years I recorded grain shipments, population tithes, and casualty reports. The numbers were vast enough to numb interpretation. 14 million tons of wheat redirected, 200,000 conscripts shipped off-world, 18,000 dead in a factorum collapse. I logged these figures without processing their human cost. I thought this made me efficient. The ecclesiarchy thought it made me complicit. They came for me on a day I had logged 347 deaths to toxic atmosphere breach in the lower hive. Standard industrial accident. Expected loss. I filed the report and began the next when the Arbites broke through my hab door. The charge was falsification of sacred records. I had, according to the Ministorum overseer who reviewed my work, intentionally underreported deaths to conceal the governor's negligence. The actual number was 409. I had logged what my supervisor provided. This distinction did not matter. The holding cell measured 3 meters by 2. 17 of us occupied that space for 6 days. The man beside me had been a teacher in the Schola. He had taught incorrect catechism, replacing "the Emperor protects" with "the Emperor provides" in a children's prayer. Heresy of the most technical kind. He wept continuously until the 4th day, when the weeping stopped, and he stared at the wall, making small clicking sounds with his tongue. On the 6th day they took him first. I never learned his name. When they brought me before the arbiter, I expected execution. Clean, final, a last round to the back of the skull, and then nothing. The arbiter was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her face augmented with a purity seal that covered the left eye socket. She read my charges without inflection. Falsification. Negligence. Complicity in deaths that could have been prevented if proper reports had triggered proper responses. She asked if I had testimony to provide. I told her I had recorded the numbers given to me. She made a notation on her data slate. "The sentence," she said, "is penitence through service. You will be rendered unto the ecclesiarchy for Arco-Flagellation. Through pain you will find redemption. Through service you will restore your worth to the emperor. Your body will become instrument of his will until death grants you final absolution." I did not understand. I asked what Arco-Flagellation meant. She looked at me with her remaining eye, and something flickered there that might have been pity, or might have been simple documentation of my ignorance. "Mercy," she said. "It means you have been granted mercy instead of execution." They transported me with 43 others to the Cathedral of Blessed Anguish. The building rose 1,100 meters from the hive floor, a structure of black stone and steel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees. I could see my breath. The others around me shivered. One man, younger than me by perhaps a decade, tried to run when they opened the transport doors. The shock collar activated, and he collapsed. They dragged him inside with the rest of us. He was still breathing, but no longer conscious. The processing chamber was efficient. They stripped us in groups of 10, catalogued our physical specifications, and assigned us serial designations. I became Penitent 773 Beta. They shaved our heads. One of the tech priests, a hunched figure more machine than man, approached me with a handheld scanner. He ran it across my skull, my spine, my major muscle groups. He made annotations in binaric cant I could not interpret. Then he marked my forehead with a stylus that burned. The pain was precise and localized. He moved to the next subject. We stood naked in that chamber for what my internal chronology estimated as 4 hours. The cold became pain, became numbness. The man beside me, Penitent 774 Beta, began to pray. He recited the litany of penance, his voice steady at first, then wavering as the cold worked deeper. Halfway through the third recitation, his words became slurred. By the fourth recitation, he had stopped making sense, inserting random words, replacing liturgy with fragments of what I assumed were personal memories. He talked about someone named Teresa, his daughter perhaps, or sister. The tech priest did not tell him to stop. They came for us individually. A servitor, its lower body replaced with tracked locomotion, approached and placed a hand on 774 Beta's shoulder. He went silent immediately. The servitor guided him through a door I had not noticed before, seamless in the black stone. 774 Beta did not resist. The door closed. I counted 317 seconds before screaming began. The sound was not human in its initial phase. It had a quality that suggested vocal cords stretched beyond their designed limits, air forced through flesh that was being fundamentally altered. It lasted 47 seconds. Then silence. Then a different sound, mechanical, rhythmic, accompanied by a wet, tearing noise I recognized from the factorums. Flesh being separated from bone. Industrial. Efficient. The servitor returned 6 minutes later. It approached another penitent. The pattern repeated. Screaming, silence, mechanical sounds. The servitor's return. I counted 12 cycles before it came for me. The chamber beyond the door was not large. Perhaps 5 meters square. Medical equipment lined the walls, but the design was wrong, purposefully so. The examination table in the center had restraints clearly visible, but also hydraulic components that suggested it could reconfigure. A tech priest stood beside it, this one more augmented than the scanner operator. His lower face had been replaced with a breathing apparatus, and 4 additional arms extended from his torso, each terminating in different specialized tools. He gestured to the table. I did not move. The servitor placed pressure on my shoulder until my legs gave way and I sat. Then it lifted me and placed me on the table. The restraints activated automatically. The tech priest leaned over me. His remaining organic eye was milky but functional. He spoke in Gothic, his voice filtered through the breathing apparatus into flat monotone. "This process," he said, "will render you into sacred instrument. Your flesh will be augmented. Your consciousness will be preserved at optimal level for penitent service. You will retain sufficient awareness to comprehend your punishment while being rendered incapable of resisting the Emperor's will. Pain is the currency of redemption. You will pay in full measure." I asked how long the process would take. He tilted his head in what might have been curiosity. "For you, subjectively, it will seem eternal. Objectively, we will complete primary conversion in 11 hours. Secondary programming will require an additional 6 days. Full integration occurs over the following month as your body adapts to what we install." He initiated the procedure. The first injection came into my spine at the base of my skull. Local anesthetic, I assumed, because the pain that followed was specific and controlled rather than overwhelming. I felt the drill entering my skull. I heard it, bone conducting the sound directly into my awareness. The frequency was high, almost ultrasonic at the edges of my perception. The tech priest was narrating his actions in binaric to what I assumed was a recording servitor. I could not see it from my position, but I heard the mechanical scratching of stylus on data slate. The drill withdrew. Something else entered the hole it had created. Thin, flexible, pushing deeper. I felt it touch something inside my brain that made my left arm spasm involuntarily. The tech priest made an adjustment. My arm went still. He pushed deeper. My vision fragmented, divided, and then reassembled. He had done something to my optical processing. Colors were sharper now, but wrong. The red of the surgical instruments had shifted toward a frequency I had no name for. "Compliance augmentation installed," he said in Gothic, perhaps for my benefit. "Subject will retain consciousness, but decision-making capacity is now mediated by sacred technology. Free will remains theoretically intact but practically inaccessible during combat stimulus." I tried to speak. My mouth would not open. He had not paralyzed me. I could feel every muscle. But the signal between intention and action had been severed for all voluntary systems except breathing and autonomous functions. He moved to my chest. The incision was vertical, sternum to navel, opened with a tool that simultaneously cut and cauterized. The smell was distinctive, burned fat and ozone. He spread the incision with a mechanical retractor, and I felt my rib cage pulled apart. Not pain exactly. Pressure. Violation. The sensation of internal spaces being made external. He removed organs. I could not see which ones, but I felt their absence, sudden voids where fullness had existed. He was speaking in Binaric again, cataloguing what he took. Heart remained, I assumed, because I could feel it beating faster, panicking in its cage while my mind remained frozen in pharmaceutical calm. He installed something into the cavity. Heavy. Cold. It settled against my spine, and I felt thin filaments spreading from it, burrowing into tissue, seeking connections. Combat stimulator integrated, the tech priest announced. Subject will experience heightened aggression in response to specific chemical triggers. Pain response will be amplified and redirected toward hostile stimulus enhancement. The more damage the subject sustains, the more effective the subject becomes until catastrophic failure. He closed my chest. The ribs came together with small sounds like breaking kindling. The flesh sealed over them, bonded with something that was not quite suture and not quite adhesive. Organic glue, perhaps. I had filed reports about its manufacture in the lower hive. Now it was inside me. My arms came next. He cut away flesh from elbow to shoulder and began installing something into the muscle tissue. Fiber bundles, synthetic. They wove between my natural muscle, and I felt them integrate, small needles penetrating and connecting. When he activated them, my arm lifted without my intention, moved through a pattern of strikes and parries I had never learned. He was testing the range of motion. Satisfied, he moved to the other arm and repeated the process. The restraints released. I could not sit up. My body was no longer responding to anything I would have called will. The tech priest began fitting external components. Braces, heavy and black, that covered my forearms. They locked into place with small sounds of metal meeting bone. He had installed anchor points directly into my skeleton. The braces were not decorative. Attachment nodes covered their surface. Weapons would mount there, I understood. I would be fitted with whatever instrument the ecclesiarchy deemed appropriate for my penitence. He rolled me over, face down. The examination table's surface was porous. I could breathe through it. He cut into my back along the spine. Parallel incisions from neck to pelvis. The pain engines went in there. I felt each one as a cold presence settling against my vertebrae. 7 distinct units. They connected to the compliance augmentation in my skull and the combat stimulator in my chest. When he activated them for testing, my entire nervous system ignited. It was not the worst pain I had ever experienced. It was different. Architectural. Designed. Pain that had been carefully calibrated to maximize awareness without causing immediate psychological collapse. I could feel every nerve ending reporting damage that was not quite damage, injury that was not quite injury, a state of suffering that existed independent of actual physical harm. He deactivated the engines after 6 seconds. The pain stopped instantly. No residual aching, no lingering sensation, like it had never existed except in memory. And the memory was perfect and complete and would never fade. Functional, he said. Subject will respond appropriately to activation. The chemical reservoirs came next. He installed them into my thighs, cylindrical implants the length of my femurs. Tubes connected them to the combat stimulator in my chest. When the programming activated, these chemicals would flood my system. Aggression stimulants, pain suppressants. Rage distilled into injectable form. I would become weapon without ceasing to be conscious. I would watch myself kill and be unable to stop or refuse or hesitate. The tech priest stepped back and examined his work. I was still face down on the table, unable to move except for breathing and small movements of my eyes. He made a gesture, and 2 servitors entered. They lifted me and placed me in a standing position. My legs held weight. The augmentations were already integrating with my nervous system. I could feel foreign components nested against bone, wrapped through muscle, embedded in places flesh was never meant to hold metal. He approached me one final time. He held a device I did not recognize, a ring of metal with inward-facing needles. He placed it around my head like a crown, and it contracted, driving the needles into my skull. Not deep, superficial. But the pain was immediate and continuous. This was not augmentation. This was punishment. Constant, unending. A reminder that I was penitent, that every moment of my remaining existence would be suffering until death granted release. "You are now Arco-Flagellant," he said. "You will be deployed in service to the Emperor. You will kill his enemies until you are destroyed. This is mercy. Remember that this is mercy." The servitors took me to another chamber. This one held 17 others like me, standing in rows unmoving. Some were fresh like me, blood still seeping from closed incisions. Others had been processed longer. Their skin had taken on a gray pallor, and their eyes did not track movement. One of them I recognized. Penitent 774 Beta, the man who had prayed beside me in the processing chamber. His chest had been opened and resealed, just as mine had. The pain crown circled his skull. His eyes met mine, and I saw that he was still present, still aware, trapped inside a body that would no longer obey him. I tried to speak. My mouth opened. Sound emerged, but not words, a groan without articulation. The compliance augmentation in my brain prevented complex communication. I could scream. I could not speak. 774 Beta made the same sound in response. Recognition between the damned. They kept us standing for what I estimated as 9 hours. My legs did not tire. The augmentations prevented fatigue. The pain crown continued its work, a baseline of suffering that never diminished. I could not sleep. The chemistry they had installed prevented it. I would stand until commanded otherwise, awake, aware, experiencing every second of existence without the mercy of unconsciousness. A priest entered the chamber. Not a tech priest. Ecclesiarchy. He wore robes of black and crimson, and his face held the serene certainty of a man who had never questioned whether his actions served a just God. He walked along our row, examining each of us. When he reached me, he stopped. "You were Marcus Thelon," he said. "You falsified records. Through negligence, you allowed the Emperor's subjects to die. You have been granted mercy, transformation into holy instrument rather than execution. Do you accept this mercy?" I could not answer. He knew I could not answer. He nodded as if I had spoken. "Your silence is acceptance," he said. "You will be deployed to the shrine world of Ophelia 7. Heretics have desecrated the Cathedral of St. Celestine. You will cleanse this defilement. You will kill until no heretic remains, or until you are destroyed in the Emperor's service. Either outcome is acceptable. Either outcome is redemption." He moved to the next penitent. He delivered the same speech. The words were ritual. We were not expected to understand or accept or find meaning. We were weapons being informed of our target, nothing more. The programming began the following day. They placed us in individual cells, each one 3 meters square, bare except for a single servo skull that floated at eye level. The skull began broadcasting directly into the compliance augmentation in my brain. Not words, pure instruction, targeting priority, movement patterns, kill sequences. The information bypassed language and embedded directly into motor memory. When I encountered a designated heretic, my body would know how to destroy them without requiring conscious decision. The sessions lasted 18 hours daily. During the remaining 6 hours, we stood in formation while tech priests performed maintenance. They opened access panels I had not known existed in my body and made adjustments. One of them replaced a component in my left bracer. Another injected something into my chemical reservoirs that made my hands shake for 20 minutes before the trembling stopped and left me feeling nothing at all. 774 Beta was in the cell beside mine. I could hear the programming broadcast through the wall, a high whine at the edge of hearing. Sometimes he made sounds, not screaming. Worse, small broken noises like an animal that had forgotten it was ever human. I wanted to respond, to offer some recognition that he was not alone in this, but I could not. The compliance augmentation prevented me from making sounds without purpose, and the only purpose I had now was violence. On the 9th day of programming, they brought someone new into the chamber. A tech priest I had not seen before, younger perhaps, less augmented. He walked along the row of cells and stopped at mine. He looked at me through the small window, and his expression was not serene. Not certain, he looked disturbed. He moved to the next cell, 774 Beta's cell. I heard him speak, low words I could not distinguish. Then silence. Then the tech priest walked away quickly, his steps uneven. I found out later what had disturbed him. 774 Beta had died. The programming had continued broadcasting into a dead man's brain for 4 hours before the monitoring servitor registered flatness in his vital signs. Heart failure. The augmentations had placed stress on organs already weakened by the transformation process. He had died standing up, eyes open, while instructions on how to kill heretics played directly into his consciousness. They removed his body. They did not replace him. Attrition was expected. Acceptable. They had started with 44 subjects. 31 remained. Efficiency was within acceptable parameters. The tech priest who had discovered 774 Beta's death returned that night. I heard him in the corridor. He was arguing with someone in hushed Gothic. I could only catch fragments, still aware. Designed that way, theological necessity, Emperor's mercy means. The conversation ended. The tech priest did not return. I never learned his name. I never learned if what disturbed him was the cruelty or simply the waste of resources. In the Imperium, these two concerns are often indistinguishable. The programming concluded on the 13th day. They assembled us in a deployment bay. 30. One Arco-Flagellant standing in formation. Our bodies augmented, our minds imprisoned, our purpose singular. A handler stood before us, a priest with a control device mounted on his wrist. He activated it, and I felt something in my brain recognize his authority. I could not disobey him. The thought of disobedience did not exist as possibility. "You will board the transport," he said. "You will deploy to Ophelia 7th. You will kill the heretics who have defiled the Emperor's shrine. You will not stop until commanded, or until you are destroyed." We boarded. The transport was a bulk carrier designed for cargo, not human passengers. We stood in the hold, mag-locked to the deck plating, for what ship's chronology indicated was 17 days. No food. The augmentations sustained us, no water. The chemistry we had been filled with prevented dehydration. No rest. We stood. We waited. Some of the others made sounds occasionally. Small, broken transmissions from minds trying to process what had been done to them. I stayed silent. I counted seconds. I remembered temperature, 37 degrees. Baseline human, what I had been before mercy. Ophelia 7th appeared in the viewport as a sphere of white and gold, its surface covered in cathedral spires that extended beyond the atmosphere into orbital space. The Shrine World. One of the most sacred places in the Imperium. Pilgrims came here in numbers that exceeded the populations of entire hive worlds. Billions moved through its processional routes annually, seeking benediction, witnessing relics, performing penance. Now heretics had come instead. The transport descended through cathedral architecture. We passed spires whose foundations were laid 10,000 years ago, structures that had been continuously expanded by generations of faithful who believed height brought them closer to the Emperor's light. The landing bay was built into the base of the Cathedral of St. Celestine, a structure I had filed reports about in my previous life. It could hold 400,000 pilgrims simultaneously. Now it held only corpses. They had been arranged deliberately. Not the random scatter of battle casualties, but careful placement. Bodies positioned to form words in High Gothic across the cathedral floor. I could read them from the transport as we descended. The corpse emperor watches from a throne of lies. 3,000 dead to write that message. Men, women, children. Pilgrims who had come seeking the emperor's blessing and found heretics instead. Our handler activated the deployment command. The mag locks released. We moved toward the exit ramp, not marching but flowing. 31 bodies moving in perfect coordination dictated by the programming installed in our brains. My consciousness observed this movement. I did not will it. My legs carried me forward because the command had been given, and my body no longer required my permission to obey. The cathedral smelled of incense and decomposition. The heretics had been here for 6 days, according to the briefing data uploaded into my compliance augmentation. They had killed the priests first, then the pilgrims, then defiled the relics. They wore the red and brass colors of the blood god's servants, Khorne. Even thinking the name caused the pain crown to activate briefly, punishment for acknowledging the archenemy's existence. I learned quickly not to name them, even internally. They were heretics, targets, designations without theology. We found the first group in the Chapel of the Martyrat, 17 of them, conducting rituals around an altar they had inverted and covered with viscera. They saw us enter. They smiled. They welcomed violence. This is what servants of the blood god do. They seek death in battle as sacrament. We provided their sacrament. The handler activated the combat protocol. My consciousness fragmented. Some part of me remained aware, observing, unable to influence what happened next. The rest of me became pure weapon. The chemical reservoirs in my thighs released their contents. Rage flooded my system, pharmaceutical fury that had no target except what the programming designated. The pain engines in my spine activated. Instead of suffering, the agony translated into speed, strength, relentless forward momentum. I moved faster than human reaction. The augmentations in my muscles fired with mechanical precision. My hands, which had once recorded grain shipments and death statistics, now tore through flesh without hesitation. I grabbed the nearest heretic, a man whose face had been ritually scarred into a mockery of a holy symbol, and I broke him. Simple. Efficient. The programming knew exactly how much force to apply, which angle produced structural failure in human skeletal systems. He was dead in 3 seconds. I moved to the next. The Arco-Flagellant beside me, I no longer knew their designation, had mounted a flail to their braces. The weapon spun, driven by servos installed in their arms, and reduced 2 heretics to component parts. Blood covered the chapel walls. The heretics fought back. They had combat training. They had faith in their dark god. None of it mattered. We were not soldiers who could be demoralized or flanked or outmaneuvered. We were autonomous weapons, each one programmed to kill until destroyed. One heretic managed to bury an axe in my shoulder. I felt it hit bone. I felt the blade lodge there. The pain engine translated this damage into increased aggression. I continued my attack pattern without pause. My left arm no longer functioned properly. The axe had severed something important, but my right arm compensated. I crushed the heretic's skull against the inverted altar. The programming moved me to the next target. The axe remained in my shoulder. It would stay there until maintenance removed it, or until catastrophic failure made its presence irrelevant. The 17 heretics died in 4 minutes. We lost no one. One Arco-Flagellant had sustained damage to their leg actuators and moved with reduced efficiency. Another had lost their right hand to a chainsword. They picked up the severed hand with their remaining hand and continued forward. The programming did not recognize the loss as sufficient reason to cease operation. The handler examined the chapel and transmitted approval codes. We moved deeper into the cathedral. More heretics, more combat. The patterns repeated. Activation. Chemical flood. Pain translation. Violence. Deactivation. We advanced through sacred spaces rendered profane, killing everything that moved and bore the markers of heresy. My consciousness watched from behind the pharmaceutical rage. I counted deaths. 43. 57. 82. I could not stop counting. It was what I had done as Marcus Thelon. I documented, I recorded. Now I documented kills instead of grain shipments. On the second day, we encountered organized resistance. The heretics had fortified the Sanctum of Perpetual Devotion, a circular chamber where pilgrims traditionally spent 40 days in continuous prayer. They had brought heavy weapons, autocannons, a missile launcher. When we entered, they opened fire without hesitation. The Arco-Flagellant in front of me ceased to exist. The autocannon rounds did not kill him. They erased him, reduced him to fragments too small to identify. The programming did not pause. 2 more died in the initial volley. A missile hit the ceiling and brought down a section of ornate stonework that crushed another Arco-Flagellant beneath tons of sacred architecture. 27 remaining. The handler transmitted intensified combat protocols. The chemical flood increased. The pain engines burned hotter. I reached the autocannon nest. 4 heretics were servicing the weapon. I killed 3 of them before the 4th managed to draw a pistol. He shot me in the chest, center mass. Good shot. The round penetrated, but hit the combat stimulator. The device absorbed the impact and released its stored energy as an electrical pulse through my nervous system. I did not feel pain. I felt power. The augmentation converted damage into fuel. I tore the heretic's throat out with my bare hand and moved to the next target. We cleared the sanctum in 18 minutes. 94 heretics dead, 5 more Arco-Flagellants destroyed. The handler's voice crackled through the Vox system built into my skull. Acceptable losses. Advance to primary objective. We advanced. 22 remaining. Still efficient. Still within acceptable parameters. The primary objective was the shrine of Saint Celestine herself, the most sacred location on Ophelia 7. The heretics had claimed it as their command center. Our handler transmitted final instructions. No prisoners, no mercy, total cleansing. The combat protocol activated before we even entered the shrine. The chemicals hit my system, and I felt Marcus Thelon dissolve into pure function. The shrine was vast, 300 meters from floor to vaulted ceiling. The heretics had gathered in numbers that suggested this was their entire remaining force. 200, maybe more. They had built barricades from pews and prayer books. They had mounted heavy bolters on the elevated platforms where priests delivered sermons. They had prepared for exactly this assault. They opened fire the moment we crossed the threshold. The first 3 Arco-Flagellants died instantly. Bolter rounds detonated inside their bodies, and they came apart like wet machinery. I felt one of them die beside me, their blood and augmentation components spraying across my torso. The programming did not acknowledge this. I moved forward. We all moved forward, relentless, unstoppable. The handler had transmitted the command, and we would execute it or be destroyed in the execution. A heavy bolter round took my left leg off below the knee. I fell. The pain engines activated at maximum intensity. The agony was total, overwhelming, but the programming translated it into continued operation. I crawled. My remaining leg and both arms dragged me toward the nearest heretic position. My left arm still had the axe embedded in the shoulder from the previous engagement. I reached the barricade and pulled myself up using a dead heretic's body as leverage. There was someone there, a heretic fighter, female, her face marked with ritual scars. She looked at me with an expression I could not interpret, not fear, something else. She raised her weapon. I was faster. The programming overrode the damage to my body, and I killed her with efficiency that had nothing to do with Marcus Thelon, and everything to do with what the ecclesiarchy had installed in his corpse. Around me, the other Arco-Flagellants were dying. I watched them fall, watched them come apart under sustained fire, watched them continue fighting, even as catastrophic damage shut down critical systems. One of them had lost everything below the waist, and still crawled forward, dragging themselves with their arms, killing heretics who came within reach. Another had been decapitated, but continued to operate for another 40 seconds before their augmentations finally recognized the loss as terminal. I killed 7 more heretics before someone put a last pistol round through my throat. The compliance augmentation in my brain registered critical damage, but not fatal. I could no longer breathe properly. Blood filled my airway. The programming adjusted. Oxygen requirements were reduced. Continue operation. I continued. The shrine fell silent after 23 minutes. The handler transmitted cessation codes. The combat protocol deactivated. The chemical flood stopped. The pain engines reduced to baseline. I became aware of my body's state. Left leg missing. Left arm barely functional with axe still embedded. Throat compromised. Multiple gunshot wounds. Blood loss exceeding 70% of total volume. The augmentations were keeping me alive through methods I did not understand and could not have survived without. 9 Arco-Flagellants remained functional. 13 were destroyed completely. The rest were damaged beyond recovery and would be processed for parts. The handler approached me. He examined my injuries with the detachment of someone evaluating equipment malfunction. Salvageable, he said to a tech priest who accompanied him. Repair and redeploy. They took us back to the transport. The tech priests worked on us in the hold, using tools that were not gentle because gentleness was inefficient. They reattached my leg, not the original. A replacement taken from one of the destroyed Arco-Flagellants. It did not fit perfectly, but the programming compensated. They removed the axe from my shoulder and sealed the wound. They repaired the damage to my throat, though my voice when I tried to make sound came out wrong, mechanical, filtered through augmentation that had replaced organic tissue. We remained on Ophelia 7 for 42 days. They deployed us 17 more times. Smaller engagements, heretic cells hiding in the lower cathedral levels, cleanup operations. Each time the pattern repeated. Activation, violence, deactivation, repair. I killed 163 heretics across those deployments. I watched 6 more Arco-Flagellants reach catastrophic failure. By the time they declared Ophelia 7th cleansed, only 4 of us remained from the original 31. They transported us to a facility on the nearby forge world of Bellicane. The tech priests there specialized in Arco-Flagellant maintenance. They placed us in individual repair bays and began systematic restoration. For me, this meant replacing components that had worn beyond function. The chemical reservoirs needed refilling. The pain engines required recalibration. Extended use had degraded their efficiency. The compliance augmentation had developed an error in its targeting protocol that made me occasionally hesitate for 0.3 seconds before executing kills. Unacceptable deviation. They corrected it. During maintenance, I stood in the repair bay for what chronology indicated was 9 days. Conscious, aware, unable to move while they disassembled and reassembled portions of my body. I could not sleep. The augmentations prevented it. I existed in continuous awareness, experiencing every second of their work. When they opened my chest to access the combat stimulator, I felt the cold air on my internal organs. When they drilled new mounting points into my bones, I felt each puncture. The pain crown ensured I forgot nothing. A tech priest approached me on the 7th day of maintenance, not one of the regular technicians, but someone different, older, more augmented. His face was almost entirely mechanical, but his eyes remained organic, pale blue and deeply tired. "Do you understand what you have become?" he asked. I could not answer. The compliance augmentation prevented communication during maintenance protocols. He seemed to expect this. "You are penitent," he continued. "The ecclesiarchy teaches that through suffering you achieve redemption. Through service you restore worth. I have maintained Arco-Flagellants for 73 years. I have never seen one survive to redemption. The average operational lifespan is 8 weeks from initial deployment. You have survived 6 weeks. Statistically, you will be destroyed within the next 14 days. This is mercy. Do you understand? Your suffering ends soon." He walked away. I processed his words. 8 weeks average survival. I had 6 weeks recorded. 14 days remaining in statistical probability. I would die soon. This should have brought comfort. It did not. The compliance augmentation had done something to my fear response. I could not fear death, because I could not fear anything except failing to execute assigned objectives. Death was simply a state change, termination of function. The programming viewed it as acceptable outcome. They completed my maintenance and deployed me again. Strike cruiser, designated Purity's Flame. Target, Space Hulk that had emerged from the warp carrying chaos corruption. My handler was different now. The previous one had been killed on Ophelia 7th by a heretic sniper. This new handler was younger, less experienced. He looked at us. 4 Arco-Flagellants standing in the deployment bay, with an expression that suggested he was not certain we were human enough to require his consideration. The Space Hulk was called Eternal Suffering. Perhaps a name it had carried before chaos touched it. Perhaps something the corrupted crew had renamed it. The designation was appropriate. We boarded through a breach the strike cruiser's guns had torn in its hull. Inside was darkness and the smell of decay that had progressed beyond biological and into metaphysical. The corruption was so absolute that the ship's structure itself seemed diseased. We encountered daemons, not heretics, not cultists, actual manifestations of the warp given temporary physical form through rituals I did not understand and was programmed not to contemplate. The pain crown activated at maximum intensity when I saw the first one, punishment for witnessing what should not exist. The agony was total. The programming translated it into killing efficiency. Daemons die differently than humans. Their physical forms are temporary constructs. Destroying them requires sustained damage until the animating warp energy dissipates. I learned this by killing them. The programming adapted in real time, adjusting my attack patterns to maximize dispersal. I tore through 3 daemons before one of them struck back with a weapon that should not have been possible, a blade made of screening. It cut through my torso, and I felt the wound in ways that exceeded physical damage. The blade had touched something deeper than flesh. The Arco-Flagellant beside me died when a demon simply looked at it. No physical contact. The daemon's attention was weapon enough. The Arco-Flagellant's augmentations failed simultaneously, and they collapsed, every system shutting down at once. The daemon moved toward me. The handler transmitted maximum combat protocols. The chemical flood reached levels that should have been fatal. My heart rate exceeded 300 beats per minute. The pain engines burned at intensity that would have caused psychological collapse in unaugmented humans. I killed the demon. I do not remember how. The programming executed actions faster than my consciousness could process. We cleared the Space Hulk in 11 hours. 2 Arco-Flagellants remained, myself and 1 other. The handler transmitted satisfaction codes and extraction orders. We returned to the strike cruiser. I had sustained damage that the tech priests evaluated as extensive but repairable. The other surviving Arco-Flagellant had damage evaluated as terminal within 6 hours. They placed him in a storage bay and let him die. There, alone, standing, aware until the final moment when his augmentations could no longer sustain the ruin of his body. I had survived 8 weeks. Statistical anomaly. The tech priests expressed interest in understanding why I had exceeded expected operational lifespan. They examined me thoroughly, taking detailed measurements, comparing my specifications to baseline Arco-Flagellant parameters. They found no significant deviations. I was simply lucky, random chance. The same statistical outlier that occasionally appears in any dataset. I had been Marcus Thelen, who recorded numbers. Now I was a number that refused to resolve into the expected average. They assigned me a new handler and deployed me to Armageddon. Orc invasion. The Greenskins had landed in numbers that exceeded Imperial defensive capacity. They were sending everything. Guard regiments, Space Marine task forces, penitent engines, Arco-Flagellants. I was one of 300 Arco-Flagellants deployed to Hive Hades. The Orcs had breached the outer walls and were fighting through the industrial districts. Our objective was to blunt their advance long enough for Guard reinforcements to establish defensive positions. The handler activated combat protocols before we even left the transport. All 300 of us hit the chemical flood simultaneously. We poured into the hive like a wave of pharmaceutical rage and augmented flesh. The orcs welcomed us with enthusiasm. They enjoyed fighting. They roared and laughed and killed with the joy of warriors who had found worthy opponents. I killed orcs. I lost count after 97. They were larger than humans, stronger, more durable. The programming compensated. Target weak points, throat, eyes, joint articulation. My hands learned the specific amount of force required to crack orc skull structure. The pain engines translated the damage they inflicted on me into increased efficiency. An orc chopper took off 3 of my fingers. I killed the orc with my remaining fingers and continued forward. The 300 Arco-Flagellants lasted 6 hours. By the end, 17 remained functional. I was one of them, 9 weeks operational. Far beyond statistical expectation, the tech priests were genuinely curious now. They examined me again, more thoroughly. They found minor variations in my brain chemistry that might explain increased resilience to the psychological trauma of continuous combat. Inconclusive data. I remained anomaly. They deployed me 9 more times over the following month. Genestealer cult on Fenris. Chaos incursion on Cadia's moon. Drukhari raid on an agri-world whose name I was not given. Each time the pattern repeated. Activation. Violence. Survival. The other Arco-Flagellants died around me in numbers that suggested the statistical models were accurate for everyone except me. 3 months operational. 4 months. 5. I stopped being Marcus Stellan somewhere in that progression. The person who had recorded grain shipments and death statistics no longer existed in any meaningful sense. I was penitent, 773 beta. I was function. I killed when activated and stood in maintenance bays when not activated. The pain crown provided continuous suffering as theological requirement. The programming prevented me from wanting anything except successful execution of assigned objectives. But something remained, some fragment that the compliance augmentation had not fully erased. It manifested as observation. I watched. I documented internally. I counted. Not just kills, but moments. The number of seconds I spent in combat. The number of seconds in maintenance. The number of times tech priests expressed surprise at my continued function. The number of handlers I served under as the previous ones died or were reassigned. On my 6th month of operation, they assigned me to a Ministorum priest named Sebastian. He was different from previous handlers. Older. He looked at me not as weapon, but as penitent. He spoke to me, despite knowing I could not respond. "You have killed in the Emperor's name for 6 months," he said. "This exceeds all expectation. Perhaps your redemption is not yet complete. Perhaps the Emperor requires more service from you. Or perhaps you are simply too broken to die properly." He deployed me carefully. Not recklessly like previous handlers who treated Arco-Flagellants as expendable ammunition. He used me precisely, activating combat protocols only when necessary. Under his command, I survived another month. 7 months operational. The tech priests began filing special reports. I had become subject of study. Statistical impossibility. The Arco-Flagellant that refused to reach catastrophic failure. Sebastian brought me to a shrine after one deployment. He stood before an icon of the Emperor and prayed aloud. I stood beside him, unable to kneel because the programming did not include that function. "I do not know if you can hear me," Sebastian said. "I do not know if enough of the man remains to understand, but I believe the Emperor preserves you for purpose. You have killed 417 of his enemies. You have served with efficiency that brings glory to the ecclesiarchy. When you finally die, you will have earned redemption through measure of blood and suffering that few achieve." I wanted to tell him that I had not achieved anything, that Marcus Stellan had been sentenced to death, and the ecclesiarchy had simply prolonged that execution through augmentation and pharmaceutical torture. That I killed because I was programmed to kill, and continued existing because random chance had not yet destroyed the machine they had made from my body. But I could not speak. The compliance augmentation prevented it. I stood beside him in silence while he prayed. 8 months operational. 9 months. The deployments continued. Each one was catalogued in my internal archive with precision that Marcus Stellan would have recognized. Deployment 73. Chaos cultists on Mordia. Kills 29. Damage sustained moderate. Deployment 74. Orc Wa on Genna. Kills 46. Damage sustained severe, required 17 days maintenance. Deployment 75. Tyrannid organisms in Underhive of St. Capelline. Kills 61. Damage sustained critical. Survival probability assessed at 14%. I survived. I always survived. The tech priests could not explain it. Handler Sebastian believed it was the Emperor's will. I knew it was simply numbers. In any large enough dataset, outliers appear. I was outlier, statistical noise that happened to be conscious, 10 months operational. They deployed me to a cathedral world where heretics had seized a shrine complex. Standard cleansing operation. Handler Sebastian activated combat protocols, and I entered the shrine with 3 other Arco-Flagellants. We encountered 47 heretics. The combat lasted 9 minutes. All 47 died. 2 of the Arco-Flagellants reached catastrophic failure. The 3rd survived with repairable damage. As we were extracting, a child emerged from behind a defaced altar. Male, perhaps 7 years old. He had been hiding during the combat. He looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. He walked closer. Handler Sebastian moved to intercept, but the child was faster. "Are you a monster?" the child asked me. I could not answer. The compliance augmentation prevented it, but something in my damaged throat made a sound, not words, a mechanical groan that might have been the ghost of Marcus Stellan trying to say yes. The child reached out and touched my hand, the one that had killed 47 heretics 9 minutes ago. His fingers were warm. I remembered temperature, 37 degrees. Baseline human, what I had been before mercy. Handler Sebastian pulled the child away gently. "He is not a monster," Sebastian told the child. "He is penitent. He serves the Emperor through suffering. When he has suffered enough, he will find redemption and peace." The child looked unconvinced. Handler Sebastian took him away to find surviving priests who could care for him. I stood in the defaced shrine and counted corpses out of habit. 47 heretics, 2 Arco-Flagellants. Total casualties, 49. I logged the number in my internal archive where it joined thousands of other numbers. Marcus Stellan's final legacy, a consciousness that could not stop counting even after everything else had been taken away. 11 months operational. They deployed me to a war zone I was not given designation for. Enemy forces I was not briefed on. Handler Sebastian activated combat protocols and sent me into urban warfare that had no clear objective except continued killing. I functioned as programmed. I survived. Others did not. The pattern had become my entire existence. 12 months operational. 1 year since they had sentenced Marcus Stellan to mercy. The ecclesiarchy noted this milestone. I had exceeded expected operational lifespan by a factor of 6. I had killed 1,293 confirmed enemies of the Imperium. I had been destroyed and repaired so many times that less than 40% of my original biological material remained. The rest was augmentation, replacement parts, synthetic tissue grown in Forge World vats. Handler Sebastian brought me before a tribunal of ecclesiarchy officials. They examined me as curiosity. The Arco-Flagellant that would not die. They discussed whether my continued survival indicated divine favor or simply represented resource inefficiency. They concluded that I would continue operation until catastrophic failure occurred naturally. I was functioning asset. The Emperor's will would determine my termination. They deployed me the next day. Chaos Space Marines had raided an orbital station. Handler Sebastian sent me with 20 other Arco-Flagellants to repel them. We boarded the station through a breach. The Chaos Marines were waiting. They killed 18 Arco-Flagellants in the first engagement. I survived. The remaining Arco-Flagellant and I killed 3 Chaos Marines through sustained combined assault that the programming coordinated with inhumane precision. The Chaos Marines withdrew. We held the station. Handler Sebastian transmitted satisfaction codes. But something had changed during that engagement. One of the Chaos Marines had looked at me before I killed him. His helmet was damaged and I could see his face. He was smiling. "You're already dead," he said. "You just haven't stopped moving yet." I killed him before he could say more. But his words remained. The compliance augmentation could not erase them, because they were not heretical doctrine requiring suppression. They were simple observation. True observation. I was dead. Marcus Thelen had died in the Cathedral of Blessed Anguish 13 months ago when they installed the compliance augmentation in his brain. What remained was animated corpse, kept functional through augmentation and programming, moved through the Imperium's wars like a puppet that had forgotten it was being controlled. 14 months operational, 15 months, 16 months. The deployments blurred together. I killed for the Imperium. I suffered continuously. The pain crown provided baseline agony that never diminished. The chemical floods during combat added their own suffering. The damage I sustained in each engagement created additional pain that the pain engines amplified and redirected. I existed in state of continuous torment that the ecclesiarchy called redemption and I called existence, because I no longer remembered anything different. Handler Sebastian grew old during my service. I watched his hair gray, his movements slow, his certainty fade. He still spoke to me, still treated me as penitent rather than weapon, but something in his eyes had changed. Doubt. Perhaps he had seen too many Arco-Flagellants die under his command. Perhaps he had begun to question whether redemption through suffering was truly the Emperor's mercy or simply the ecclesiarchy's method of extracting final utility from the condemned. He never voiced these doubts. Doubt was heresy. He performed his duties faithfully until the day a stray round from a firefight took him in the throat. I was not deployed at the time. I was standing in a maintenance bay while tech priests replaced my left eye with a synthetic that improved target acquisition. I received notification of Handler Sebastian's death through the command network. Handler Sebastian deceased, new handler assigned. Penitent 773 Beta continue operation. I had served under Handler Sebastian for 11 months. In that time, he had deployed me 46 times. I had killed 409 enemies under his command. He had spoken to me 173 times. Every word logged in my internal archive because I could not forget anything. The compliance augmentation preserved all data with perfect clarity. I would remember every word he ever spoke to me for however long I continued functioning. The new handler did not speak to me at all. I became weapon again. Tool. Expendable asset to be deployed with maximum aggression and minimum concern for preservation. Under this handler, I sustained damage that should have been terminal. My right arm was severed at the elbow by a power weapon. They replaced it with a bionic that functioned more efficiently than the organic limb it replaced. My legs were crushed when a building collapsed during urban combat. They replaced them with augmented limbs that could run faster and longer without fatigue. My lungs were damaged by toxic atmosphere exposure. They replaced respiratory function with a mechanical system that processed oxygen more efficiently. I was becoming more machine than man. The tech priests noted this in their maintenance reports. Subject 773. Beta approaching 60% augmentation. At 70% augmentation, the distinction between Arco-Flagellant and combat servitor became theological rather than practical. Servitors had no consciousness. Arco-Flagellants retained awareness as part of their punishment, but if the biological components declined below certain thresholds, what remained conscious? What suffered? I suffered. I knew this with absolute certainty. Every second of my existence was documented agony. The pain crown, the combat chemicals, the damage, the repairs, the continuous awareness without rest or sleep or mercy. I suffered, and the suffering had meaning only because the ecclesiarchy said it did. Redemption through torment, purpose through punishment. These were theological concepts I could not process or accept or reject. They simply were, like the compliance augmentation in my brain, like the programming that moved my body, like the next deployment that was always coming. 18 months operational. They sent me to a dead world designated Khartoum Sigma. No enemy forces detected. Instead, archaeotech excavation had awakened something that killed the research team. 40 tech priests and 300 servitors missing, presumed dead. I deployed with 12 other Arco-Flagellants and ascended into excavation tunnels that extended 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface. We found the tech priests. They had been transformed into something that was not quite chaos corruption and not quite alien infestation. They moved wrong. They spoke in languages that caused the pain crown to activate at maximum intensity just from hearing them. We killed them, all 40. Then we found what they had awakened. I do not have adequate vocabulary to describe it. The compliance augmentation prevented me from forming thoughts about it that resolved into coherent concepts. It was old. It had been imprisoned beneath Khartoum Sigma since before the Imperium existed. The tech priests had broken its containment. Now it was free. It killed 8 Arco-Flagellants before the handler transmitted retreat orders. The 4 of us who remained extracted while the Inquisition ordered orbital bombardment. We watched from orbit as they destroyed Khartoum Sigma, cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, sustained land strikes until the planet's crust fractured and exposed the mantle. They burned the world to bedrock and slag, ensuring that whatever the tech priests had found would never threaten the Imperium again. 40 tech priests dead, 300 servitors destroyed, 8 Arco-Flagellants lost, 1 planet rendered uninhabitable. Acceptable losses to prevent chaos manifestation. The operation was classified as successful. I had survived again. 19 months operational. Statistical impossibility had become my defining characteristic. The ecclesiarchy began transferring me between theaters, specifically because my survival rate exceeded all other Arco-Flagellants. I was asset worth preserving. They gave me marginally better maintenance, slightly more conservative deployment parameters. They were trying to extend my operational lifespan further, to understand what made me different. I was not different. I was simply lucky. Random chance expressed across enough deployments to create the illusion of significance. Marcus Stellan had understood statistics. 1 data point in a billion will deviate so far from the mean that it appears miraculous. I was that data point. Nothing more. 20 months operational. They deployed me to a fortress monastery under siege. Space Marines defending against demonic incursion. I fought beside Astartes warriors whose names I was not cleared to know. They killed with precision that made my own combat efficiency seem crude by comparison. But they acknowledged my function. One of them spoke to me after an engagement. "You have served well, penitent," he said. His voice was deep, filtered through his armor's Vox system. The Emperor recognizes faithful service regardless of form. I could not respond. He did not expect me to. He moved on to the next battle. I stood in the fortress corridor and processed his words. Faithful service. I did not serve faithfully. I served because the programming compelled me to serve. Faith required choice. I had no choice. The compliance augmentation had taken choice and replaced it with inevitability. 22 months operational. The tech priests who maintained me began showing me to other tech priests as example of optimal Arco-Flagellant design. They had not changed anything about my construction. I was standard configuration. But my survival suggested that random variation in the conversion process could produce significantly enhanced operational parameters. They wanted to identify which variables contributed to my longevity so they could replicate it in future subjects. They never identified the variables. I was an anomaly that could not be explained or reproduced. Eventually, they stopped trying. I remained unique. The Arco-Flagellant that would not die, serving the Imperium through continuous suffering that the ecclesiarchy promised would eventually bring redemption. I no longer believed in redemption. The compliance augmentation prevented me from believing or disbelieving in theological concepts. But the fragment of Arco-Flagellant that still observed and documented and counted had reached conclusion. There was no redemption. There was only function and failure. I functioned. Others failed. The system continued regardless. 24 months operational. 2 years since Arco-Flagellant became Penitent 773 Beta, I had killed 2,467 confirmed enemies of the Imperium. I had been deployed 139 times across 42 different war zones. I had sustained damage requiring major reconstruction 17 times. 73% of my body was now augmentation. Only my brain, portions of my torso, and fragments of my original limbs remained biological. They deployed me to a shrine world where pilgrims had been infected with plague. Not chaos plague. Simple disease that had mutated beyond Medicaid capability to treat. The infected had become violent, attacking the healthy in patterns that suggested diminished consciousness but coordinated purpose. The ecclesiarchy declared them tainted. Cleansing required. I killed infected pilgrims. They did not fight back effectively. Many of them were elderly. Children. They died easily. The combat protocols activated, and I moved through the shrine complex, ending lives that had come seeking the Emperor's blessing, and found plague instead. I killed 347 infected over 6 hours of continuous operation. This was not battle. This was extermination. The programming did not distinguish. Targets were designated. Targets were eliminated. After extraction, Handler designation unknown spoke to the Ministorum officials who had ordered the cleansing. The Arco-Flagellant functioned efficiently, the handler reported. No complications, recommended for continued operation. One of the officials looked at me. His expression held something I recognized from my previous life. Disgust. Not at what I had become, but at what I represented. The Imperium's willingness to convert humans into weapons, to call suffering mercy, to categorize mass killing as redemption. He said nothing. Disgust was not heresy if you kept it internal. He authorized my redeployment and moved on to other administrative duties. I stood in the shrine complex and counted bodies. 347, added to my internal archive, the number that Arco-Flagellant had become. 26 months operational. I began to experience errors. Small glitches in the compliance augmentation. Moments where the programming lagged 0.5 seconds before executing commands. The tech priests identified this as cumulative damage to neural pathways. The augmentation was degrading. They could repair it, but each repair introduced additional degradation. Eventually, the system would reach critical failure. How long? A tech priest asked his superior during one maintenance session. Unknown. The superior responded. Subject has exceeded all projections. Additional operation time cannot be estimated with confidence. Could be weeks, could be years. They continued repairs. I continued operation. 28 months, 30 months. The errors increased in frequency. Sometimes my left arm would lock during combat, forcing me to compensate with right arm-only attack patterns. Sometimes my visual processing would fragment, dividing the battlefield into overlapping images I had to mentally reconcile. Sometimes the pain crown would activate without cause, punishment for violations I had not committed. The tech priests noted these malfunctions but could not prevent them. The compliance augmentation was failing. When it failed completely, I would either die or become non-operational in ways that required my destruction. Either way, my service was approaching termination. I felt nothing about this. The augmentation prevented emotional response to my own impending cessation. But the fragment of Arco-Flagellant that still observed made notation. The mercy is ending. The temporary torture before death is reaching its conclusion. 2 years, 8 months of suffering will end. The system will have extracted all possible utility and will discard the remainder. 32 months operational. They deployed me one final time. I did not know it was final. The deployment seemed routine. Enemy, Chaos Cultists. Location, Industrial Complex on Hiveworld Tertius Secundus. Objective, Elimination. Standard parameters. I entered the complex with 6 other Arco-Flagellants. The handler activated combat protocols. The chemical flood hit my system and I became weapon. The cultists fought back with small arms and improvised explosives. We killed them efficiently. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. All targets eliminated. 5 Arco-Flagellants remained functional. I was extracting when the compliance augmentation failed. Total failure. Complete cessation of controlling protocols. For the first time in 32 months, my body responded to my will instead of the programming. I stopped walking. The other Arco-Flagellants continued without me. The handler transmitted movement commands. I did not obey. I could not obey. The augmentation that had made obedience involuntary was no longer functioning. The handler transmitted emergency shutdown codes. Nothing happened. My body remained my own. I stood in the industrial complex and experienced choice for the first time since becoming Penitent 773 Beta. I could walk forward. I could turn around. I could fall down. I could do anything except continue being weapon. The pain crown was still functioning. It activated at maximum intensity, punishment for my failure to obey. The agony was absolute, but without the programming to translate it into continued operation, it was just pain. Pure suffering without purpose. I collapsed. My augmented legs could have held my weight, but I chose to fall. That choice was the first free decision Marcus Thelen had made in nearly 3 years. The handler approached me. He looked confused. Arco-Flagellants did not malfunction this way. They either functioned or reached catastrophic failure. I was demonstrating third state, consciousness without control systems, freedom. Penitent 773 Beta, the handler said. Respond to commands. I could not speak. The throat augmentation that had replaced my organic vocal cords was not designed for language. But I could move my head. I looked at the handler and attempted to communicate the only truth that mattered. I will not kill for you anymore. He did not understand. He transmitted emergency recovery signals. Tech priests would arrive soon to retrieve malfunctioning asset. They would repair the compliance augmentation or destroy me if repair was impossible. Either outcome was acceptable to them. I had perhaps 10 minutes before recovery team arrived. 10 minutes of freedom. I used them to remember. I remembered Marcus Thelen, not the data clerk who had filed false reports, the man before that. I remembered being 7 years old, standing in my mother's garden on a world whose name I could no longer retrieve from corrupted memory files. I remembered the warmth of sunlight on my face. Real sunlight, not the artificial illumination of hive cities. I remembered my mother's voice singing something whose melody survived, even though the words had degraded. I remembered being human in ways that had nothing to do with flesh, and everything to do with the simple presence of choice. The recovery team arrived. They lifted me efficiently and transported me to a medical bay. The tech priests examined the compliance augmentation and determined it was beyond repair. Too much cumulative damage. The neural pathways had degraded past restoration threshold. I could not be returned to operational status. They brought me before an ecclesiarchy tribunal to determine disposition. I stood before them unable to speak, while they discussed what to do with Arco-Flagellant that could no longer be controlled. Destruction is standard protocol, one official said. The subject has served for 32 months, another responded. This exceeds expected lifespan by a factor of 8. Significant service record. Theological question. Has the subject achieved redemption through their suffering? They debated for 18 minutes. Finally, they reached decision. The subject will be granted the Emperor's peace, the senior official declared. Their service, while unprecedented in duration, has reached conclusion. Redemption is assessed as earned through measure of blood and suffering. Execution will be performed with full benediction. They brought me to a chapel. Small, unremarkable. A priest I did not know stood before an altar and read benediction. He spoke about Marcus Stellan's crimes. He spoke about my 2 years and 8 months of service. He spoke about redemption earned through faithful suffering. He was wrong about faithful. I had not been faithful. I had been programmed. But he believed what he was saying. His faith was real, even if mine had never been. In the Emperor's name, he concluded, this penitent is granted absolution. Their crimes are forgiven. Their suffering is ended. Go now to the Emperor's side, redeemed and whole. The executioner raised a bolt pistol. He aimed at my head. I looked at him and attempted one final time to speak. The throat augmentation produced only mechanical sounds, but I shaped my damaged mouth around words I hoped he would understand. Thank you. He fired. The bolt round entered my skull and detonated. Marcus Stellan died. Again. Finally. The mercy was complete. I exist now only as testimony. Data preserved in Ecclesiarchy archives. Penitent 773 Beta. Operational duration 32 months, 6 days, 14 hours. Confirmed kills 2,467. Successful deployments 142. Status destroyed. Redemption granted. The system calls this mercy. The system processes thousands of penitents annually, extracting final utility from those it has condemned, converting human consciousness into weaponized suffering. Most die within weeks. Some survive longer. None survive forever. But for however long they function, they serve, they kill, they suffer. They demonstrate that the Imperium's hunger extends even beyond death, that execution is not efficient enough, that the condemned must first be rendered into instruments of the very system that judged them. I was Marcus Stellan. I filed false reports. I was complicit in negligent deaths. I was sentenced to Arco-Flagellation. I became weapon. I killed for nearly 3 years. I suffered every second of that existence. The Ecclesiarchy says I earned redemption. I do not know if redemption exists. I know only that the suffering ended. That after 32 months of continuous agony and pharmaceutical rage and consciousness trapped in machinery that would not let me die, someone finally granted me what the Imperium calls mercy and what I called cessation. The temperature of my body at death was 41 degrees Celsius, elevated from combat stimulation and system failure. Not the 37 degrees baseline I remembered from before mercy. I died warmer than I had lived. This is the only blessing I can identify in the entire process. I died warm. The pain crown was still active when the bolt round destroyed my brain. In the final microsecond of consciousness, I was still suffering, still paying the price for Marcus Stellan's crimes, still demonstrating that in the Imperium, mercy is just another word for systematic torture that eventually terminates. They will make more like me. The Ecclesiarchy produces thousands of Arco-Flagellants every year. Each one is unique only in the specific details of their suffering. The process remains constant. The outcome remains constant. Brief service, continuous agony, death within weeks. This was mercy. This is mercy. This will continue to be mercy until the Imperium falls or transforms or admits that what it calls redemption is simply another mechanism of consumption. I am archived now. Data without consciousness. But if testimony could persist beyond death, I would testify to this. I was human once. The Imperium took that humanity and converted it into weapon. The weapon functioned efficiently. The weapon killed the Emperor's enemies. The weapon suffered as designed. The weapon was destroyed when it could no longer function. And through all of this, somewhere deep in the augmented flesh and chemical rage and programmed violence, Marcus Stellan remained just aware enough to count the cost. 2,467 lives taken. 32 months of continuous suffering. 1 execution delayed by 2 years and 8 months. While they extracted utility from my condemned flesh. This was mercy. Remember that. When the Ecclesiarchy speaks of redemption through penitent service, when they offer Arco-Flagellation instead of execution, when they call transformation into weaponized suffering a gift of the Emperor's grace, remember Marcus Stellan. Remember Penitent 773 Beta. Remember that mercy is temporary torture before death. Remember that the system calls this redemption. I remembered temperature 37 degrees. Baseline human. What I was before mercy. What I could never be again once the Imperium decided that my death alone was insufficient payment. They required my life first, all of it, every second, every fragment of consciousness, every moment of suffering. They took it all and called it mercy. The testimony ends here. The data concludes. The archive closes. Arco-Flagellant is destroyed. Penitent 73 Beta is destroyed. What remains is only record. But record persists. And perhaps that persistence is its own kind of mercy. Not for me, but for whoever encounters this testimony and understands what the Imperium truly is, what it truly costs, what mercy truly means when spoken by those who have learned to call torture redemption and call it without doubt or hesitation or shame. The temperature was 37 degrees. I was human once. I remembered warmth.